again, moving slightly in a different direction, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the allegations that Beyonce's sportswear range for Topshop is being produced by sweatshops. And how does that sort of impact on our brand, if that is in fact true?
We talked a lot about that. I think you...
Yeah, this is kind of something that was interesting to me because I suppose recently I've been reading some disability studies scholarship which talks about the need to think about sweatshops in the production of impairment. Particularly the articles talk about in this global north, global south context. And so we need to start thinking about the global north's role in producing impairment in the global south, in sweatshops and things like that. And when I actually started to look into this a little bit more, in some ways it's, if the allegations are true, and you can't say whether Beyonce knows or doesn't know or all those kind of things, but it does kind of seem inconsistent with some of the activism that she does do. I think she's a co-founder of Chime for Change, and so I think from what I was reading, the role of it is to give voice to girls and women around the world and do different little projects to enable that objective. So I don't know, if you've got women working in those places and that's the message that, and then on the other hand you've got this other message, to me it kind of seems inconsistent.
I think you brought up an interesting point of whether Beyonce knows, because obviously she's got a lot of people working for her. So we do have to question, I think, with any celebrity, how much involvement do they actually have when it comes to something that they produce, whether it's a clothing line or a perfume range or whatever it might be. There tends to be, they pretend that they're a part of it quite often. They'll be like, oh yes, I helped to make this perfume, or, I chose this, I chose that. But I think at the end of the day, they do have this huge team of people working for them. So it could very well be that they keep certain secrets from her to protect her as well, so that she can, almost claim ignorance and kind of not be part of that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but if her name is on it, I think she should be held accountable.
That's true.
And it kind of illustrates the problem with this neoliberal feminist framework, and it reminds us of Audre Lorde's work, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So more money doesn't mean more equal because she's making more money out of people in Bangladesh who work for 30 cents a day or something.
Yeah.
And I think we can make that argument that yes, she's a business, yes, she's selling products, she wants to make a profit, that's the point. And when I talk about this production of impairment, I'm not focusing on just Beyonce itself, but I think if this is the case, then we need to start questioning, particularly those power relations between the two, global north and global south context, and start to perhaps dismantle those, and celebrity maybe is a way that those things can be called into question, or conditions can be set that are upheld, I suppose.
It's interesting though, because there's a lot of companies that do use sweatshops, and we're aware of it, and yet we still purchase those products as consumers generally. Nike is a prime example of that, where there was, a huge uproar about it, and yet, I don't know how much they've changed what they're doing, I don't know the details of that, but the fact of the matter is their brand is still huge and still ongoing. It didn't shut down their brand in any way.
Which brand did you say?
Nike.
Oh, Nike, right,
so
yeah.
Depends how you pronounce it.
I don't buy Nike.
No, there you go. But yeah, there are a lot of people out there that do. It is still a top brand and hugely successful. So I think there needs to be a little bit more about, I guess, our own consumer habits and making the right choices. Because I think at the end of the day, consumers do have power to make those differences and make companies make a change as well. Was the question?
The question is whether or not the consumer should be held responsible. Because actually, I think before in previous decades there were actually regulations against being able to set up companies in other parts of the world and exploit the working poor. If the consumer is looking between two choices and one is sexier or one is cheaper, they're going to go with that. They're making a consumer choice in that particular moment, and they can't sort of be held accountable for global injustice. I don't think. I think there's got to be some, restrictions placed on the companies to say employ American workers. It's an American company, and that eliminates that problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I come from a very left-oriented, kind of Marxist almost university, where I found a theory of Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. I don't know if anyone ever heard about it. It's really interesting because it kind of explains how the capitalist system and entertainment and like everything we're talking about right now is aimed to keep itself going, and it's like making it harder and harder for us all to think outside these boxes, to imagine like other worlds or other possibilities and step outside it, which is very much the case for Beyoncé as feminist, or this entire construct of like exploitation of the South, because no one is personally responsible for it, but no one really can break free from it and still be successful in our capitalist framework. So we're stuck. And I think even though we do need to survive on a daily basis in the system, and it still is very good to be aware of our own privileges, like the fact that we're here with no one here is black, and yet we're discussing like racial inequality, which already shows how the system works, because we get to be in Barcelona and others don't. So it's still, I think we need to push ourselves, especially in academia, especially in like feminist studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies. We need to push ourselves to try to find these boundaries and push them further and try to reach outside, how difficult that may be.
Because I think the most striking point for me, and I ended up sharing it with my students last semester, because it was tied to not just the article that I was reading was not tied just to sweatshops, but war and all those kind of things. And the quote was basically something along the lines of, these power imbalances tell us the people who and lives who are valued, whose lives matter, whose lives are valued, whose lives are important, and those who aren't. And it kind of sets up this frame of who matters, which I think is very scary.
Again, moving into a slightly different direction. This is a big question for you guys. But do you think Beyoncé is considered an icon, or will be iconic and have that same lasting power that we talked about yesterday with people like James Dean, who's lasted 60 years post-death and will continue to for, I think, decades to come?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Yeah, every album she has produced is showing her growth and her ability to be very creative and incorporate new elements and change the scene. Lemonade is really an album, like normally you listen to an album, you buy it and you listen to it, but I would advise all of you to not listen to Lemonade, but watch it and notice the poetry used by this very talented poet, Warsan Shire, and the imagery that is so symbolical and so metaphorical and allegorical in a way. So I think these are all pointers that show us that something is very special about Beyoncé, because she's so mainstream, yet does very interesting things, and they all sell. She's able to perform Formation at the Super Bowl. I mean, that's groundbreaking. So yeah, I definitely think she is already iconic and will remain so.
Do you guys have any thoughts on it?
I'm not sure. I think so, but I think also Celia and I have been speaking recently about grief and death around celebrity, and how perhaps social media has changed the way that grief and death of celebrity is happening.
Yes.
And so perhaps even people who won't be seen as iconic in the future, there's been a public outpouring of grief for those individuals. People like Paul Walker, I don't know, we've mostly spoken about, pardon?
I was going to say Prins.
Yeah, we've mostly spoken about Paul Walker, so I can't really think of another one.
Diana.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Even like Whitney Houston, people like that, there's been this public outpouring of grief on social media. So starting to think about what grief looks like now, and whether that will shift into then iconic status.
I think
that's
that's
not making any sense.
No, that's a really good point, because I think there's a difference between the impact they have on their death at that time online. I don't think that reflects the iconic status they'll have long term. I actually wrote a paper on Paul Walker a few years ago now, and it was discussing that idea of whether he would be iconic. And you know, like Steve McQueen, he was attached to this idea of racing and things like that. And like James Dean, he died in a car accident. So there was these interesting similarities between Paul Walker and these icons. Having said that, there is surprisingly a lot of people that still don't know who Paul Walker is. And you know, unless they actually watch the Fast and Furious films, which is what he's most known for, they may not necessarily know much about him. I think there's a certain generation that were fans of his for sure, and I think the Fast and Furious films has a huge cult following that will continue, I think, with maybe having people remember who he was. But I think the difference between the franchise maybe being somewhat, I wouldn't say iconic, but something that lasts, versus Paul Walker being someone who lasts, I think is a different thing. And you know, it comes down to that thing where is it the films that are remembered, or is it the stars themselves that become iconic? And I think there's a huge difference between those two.
And I think Beyonce will kind of have both. I think that she might, but yeah, I don't know if there's two separate things to have.
I think also there's an interesting difference between singers and actors as well. So someone like Elvis and Michael Jackson, who are definitely iconic, they've got the visual representation, which I spoke a little bit about yesterday in my Paul Newman presentation, but they've also got music that can be played at any place at any time, which works as a constant reminder to us of who they are and what they did. And so Beyonce may also have that lasting power in that sense. Whereas with a film, unless you actually sit down and watch it, or it's not repeated on TV, then that's going to be different. Again, media is changing, where TV is not really something people necessarily watch, so you would actually have to choose to select something online to watch it. It's not like the old days where you might just turn on the TV and this movie happens to be on. And you know, growing up, Elvis movies were on TV all the time, so I grew up watching Elvis and love Elvis, but I think there's a difference where that's going to change, I think, with how we consume things, and that idea of convergence. So.
Actually, didn't we say there's a Beyonce Day in Amsterdam?
Yeah, so we have International Beyonce Day. I don't know if that's a thing in other countries as well. Yeah, so this year we had like a huge debate, and around 200-300 people showed up to just talk about Beyonce for 4 hours. So there were different panels discussing her feminist identity, anti-racism, and so Beyonce really was used as a way into all these greater debates, right, about gender and feminism and race and oppression in the Netherlands and how it works. So, and afterwards there were parties in Amsterdam and Utrecht and Rotterdam. All our big cities had Beyonce parties. You could see documentaries in the cinemas about her fans waiting for B. So yeah, it's a thing in the Netherlands. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Which already shows like how amazing that is, because she's still here, and like when she released Lemonade, every single newspaper, magazine, talk show, like they all discussed it, which showed me that I chose the right thesis topic.
Cool. Well, are there any other questions from the audience at all? Yes, Dave.
I think it's always really important to understand that it may not play the same everywhere. And there's been a lot by one of my colleagues, Sean Redmond, writing about Bowie and his death. And there's an entire part of the world that has no relationship to Bowie at all. It's not that I would have the same relationship with Beyonce, but there is something about the dispersion in the way in which we engage with media, which produces a different kind of iconicity in contemporary studies. So it's totally possible, absolutely possible, for a person to not be connected to Beyonce at all, and to live in that sort of space and not feel like they're even what they would have felt like if they said, you don't know who Michael Jackson was in 1995 or something like that. It isn't the same. So even though incredible power in those sorts of things, it isn't the same. It doesn't play in the same way in each country. Like that just seems massively bizarre that someone would spend 4 hours talking about Beyonce. Having said that, we're doing that right now. So, but it's also it's also, the other thing I would say about the commentary too, about the capitalist sort of structures is, what is the difference between now and former forms of slavery 2,000 years ago? The difference is, probably, we don't know this for a fact, is that there is an engagement in a discussion about the goodness or badness around that you don't see in Socrates' discussions of how democracy works at that time, although maybe it's somehow embedded in a relationship of relative notions of freedom within slavery. And what you're identifying within capitalism is a relative notion of emancipation and constraint. So in this room, we have the variety of, again, complete variety of dressing styles, complete individualization of the relationship to the contemporary moment, which would probably be incomprehensible except at the most elite structure in the 18th century, right? And you could maybe see the portraiture that was produced at that time, but if you were to make a claim about capitalism, you'd have to make the claim about what is the percentage of the population who benefits from a wildly crazy consumerist system, and what are the disparities of wealth. And that would get you into the debates about that emerged from the Occupy Wall Street, the 99%, and so on in other countries. So it's a really complicated debate around those sorts of things that is probably how you would define that in terms of celebrity. I don't know. How you define that in terms of Beyonce, its relationships. I think the best thing you can do is to use the text, much like you're suggesting, in a literary way, and sort of say, this actually is one of the differences of the contemporary moment. We can debate these things. We may get shut down in certain places, but it can be a proliferation of certain debates.
I think that another phenomenon of replication of the Beyoncé model, for example, in Romania, we have some singers that usually look at Beyoncé as a model and recontextualize her style of clothes, her style of music, and also this model of Jay-Z and Beyoncé couple. We have it in Romania. So although there is not so much engagement in this Beyoncé phenomenon, there are some recontextualization of the model in local public spheres, which also is a proof that there is a high and very institutionalized Beyoncé model, global model of celebrity.
Amsterdam, for me, only being there a few days, incredibly complex. Also, a weird relationship to public space that was more foreign to me than almost anywhere that I've been in the world. And so all those things would be how they would re-interpellate the notion of the hailing of Beyoncé into their culture. And that 4 hours would be just, mind-blowing to me. It's like, oh, okay. So they're playing with, a colonial, post-colonial relationship in a different context, in a different historical trajectory. Fascinating sort of things, but very particularized. I did this thing on, not published yet, but on tribute bands. And it's the same sort of thing, this idea that these people take it on, but it may not be actually when they perform it. It may not be what you think it is. It's not, they may feel like they're embodying that particular star, but the audience is treating it as they're just dedicated performers and they've done it themselves. So you never know with some of these things.
I remember really admiring Madonna because of what I imagined was her clever employment of critical perspectives on race and gender and sexuality. And 10 years later, learning, and just incidentally, that and maybe seeing her interview and realizing that she wasn't that clever about those things. In fact, she had some people on her staff, or maybe she was on their staff, right? Who were very clever about those things and in a very postmodern way. And So it prompts me to ask, are there good studies of the relationship between the performer and the icon? In the case of Beyonce, we're talking about her as though she's very clever and as though she's a great entrepreneur and creative person. How politically aware is she? Is it that she, I know there's the issue of to what extent is she her father's sort of instrument?
Part of the problem is that she is a businesswoman, and I do find it problematic just to say that it's because of her father, but she has been trained from a very young age. Like at the beginning of what is it, Flawless, you see her on stage at Star Search, so she was, probably 10 years old then, and then, but it kind of like goes into the whole thing. Is she really a feminist, or is this just a marketing brand? Is it something that she wears on her lapel? But you watch the beginning of the video you showed us yesterday at the Billboard Awards. That was Formation. Oh no, that was going into Flawless. What was that?
Run the World.
Run the World, and it's 1,000 replicated Beyonce's, and then the next thing she's saying she's a feminist, but it's very individualized and not so much about the movement as it is about herself, and this is just another way for her to get more young girls and women to buy her product.
Maybe we should be talking about her as precisely the kind of a feminist that could emerge from a reciprocal relationship. This would be a Marxist way of talking about it.
Yes.
Among the audiences and the apparatus that makes her to emerge as an icon and some part of herself.
I would have to leave it there, and I think we should definitely continue the conversation, perhaps over lunch or tea breaks later on. So please join me in welcoming and thanking the delegates here today.